The moment I stepped out of my car and stared at the barren patch of dirt where my once thriving garden had stood, my heart sank and my hands trembled with rage because the flowers I had spent years cultivating, the beds I had arranged with meticulous care, and the vegetables I had nurtured season after season were gone, all ripped away as though they had never existed, leaving behind only piles of soil and scattered roots. Before I even had time to process the devastation, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors, all telling me the same story, that while I was away visiting family, Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of our HOA, had marched onto my property with a hired crew and declared that my garden violated community aesthetics, so she had ordered it all removed without permission. The shock and fury that boiled in my chest were nearly unbearable, because this wasn't just a matter of plants being stolen. It was my sanctuary, the space where I found peace after long days at work, the living legacy of my late grandmother, who taught me to love gardening. I stood there, fists clenched and eyes scanning the destruction. I knew immediately that this wasn't going to end with a polite letter or a neighborly chat. It was going to be a battle. And before I dive into how it all unfolded, I want you to stick with me until the end of this story. Because what Karen thought would be her victory turned into her ultimate humiliation. One that involved not just the HOA, but the state itself, stepping in and hitting her with a penalty she never saw coming. If you love hearing about HOA Karens finally facing justice, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories, because this is one battle you won't want to miss. In that moment of shock, I bent down to the soil, running my hands through the torn roots, the snapped stems and the crushed petals, almost unable to believe my eyes. When I finally gathered myself enough to knock on a few neighbors' doors, I heard the same thing again and again. Karen had strutted around like a queen, giving people orders, yelling at the workers she had called in, telling anyone who asked that the HOA bylaws were clear and my garden violated landscaping rules. But I had checked those bylaws many times before, and I knew that what she claimed was nonsense. I wasn't breaking a single rule. In fact, my garden had even been featured in a local magazine the year before as a model for eco-friendly community design. The anger in me grew, and I pulled out my phone, documenting every inch of the destruction. The empty space where my grandmother's rose bushes had been, the gaps in the hedges where my carefully planted lilies had bloomed. I sent photos to the HOA board demanding an explanation, but of course, the first reply I got was from Karen herself, smugly declaring that the unsightly mess was a detriment to property values and that she had done the neighborhood a favor. By removing it, I wanted to scream at her, but instead, I decided I would fight smarter than she ever expected. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread before me, the HOA bylaws, my landscaping approvals from years prior, the magazine article featuring my garden, and the notes from neighbors who had witnessed Karen's arrogant display. The more I gathered, the clearer it became that Karen had overstepped her authority, acting on her own without the board's approval, something that even HOA law made clear was forbidden. I filed a formal complaint to the HOA board and made sure to attach all the evidence, expecting they would at least reprimand her. But instead of siding with me, the board seemed reluctant, almost as if they were afraid of Karen's wrath, and I received a generic response saying they would look into it. That vague dismissal only fueled my determination, because if the HOA wouldn't act, I knew I would have to escalate this beyond them. The turning point came a few days later when I was speaking with my neighbor Sarah, who whispered to me over her fence that she had overheard Karen bragging to another board. Remember about how she taught me a lesson and how no one would dare cross her authority again? It wasn't just about the garden. It was about power. It's about Karen's desperate need to control everyone around her, and that made my blood boil even more. I knew right then that this wasn't going to be solved by petty emails or HOA meetings. I needed to hit her where it really hurt, in a way she couldn't wriggle out of. I began researching state property laws, reading late into the night until I stumbled on something that made my heart race with excitement: laws protecting homeowners from unauthorized destruction of landscaping, especially when it involved plant species classified as heritage or protected. My garden, with its heirloom roses and native plants, wasn't just a hobby. It was protected under those very statutes. And if Karen had ordered their removal, She hadn't just violated HOA bylaws, she had violated state law. The next morning, I called the state's Department of Environmental Quality and explained what happened, sending them the photos, the receipts of my plants, and the statements from neighbors. The official on the phone didn't hesitate. He told me this was a serious matter and that I should expect an inspector to visit within the week. When I hung up, I almost laughed, imagining Karen's smug face when she realized this was no longer just an HOA squabble. Over the next few days, I kept documenting everything: the empty plots, the emails from Karen, and even her dismissive comments to neighbors. And true to their word, the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, walking carefully around my yard, taking photos, asking questions, and nodding seriously as I explained every detail. He confirmed that many of the plants Karen had removed were indeed protected under state law, and that her unauthorized actions could lead to fines not just against her personally, but against the HOA as well. That was the first moment since I had returned home that I felt hope, a flicker of justice waiting to catch flame. But Karen didn't know any of this yet, and in her arrogance, she continued to act as though she was untouchable. She sent me another email, mocking my tantrum over the garden and telling me that if I wanted to avoid further issues, I should replace it with approved landscaping like decorative gravel or sod. I read that email with a smirk, because what she didn't realize was that every word she wrote, every arrogant declaration, was only adding to the evidence I was building against her. When the HOA board called an emergency meeting a week later, I walked in with a folder of documents and a calm smile, while Karen sat at the head of the table looking pleased with herself, ready to gloat. She had no idea that her world was about to come crashing down. And that's exactly where I'll leave you for now, because what happened next was more satisfying than anything I could have imagined. Karen thought she could destroy my garden and walk away without consequences. But the state had other plans, and when the letter arrived in her mailbox, the look on her face was priceless. Stay tuned, because in the next segment, you'll see how Karen's arrogance turned into sheer panic when the fine landed and her empire of control started to crumble. When I came home and saw the bare patch of land where my thriving garden had once stood, I could hardly breathe. And as I stumbled through the wreckage of what used to be rows of tomatoes, bright marigolds, fragrant lavender, and neat patches of herbs, I realized that what had been destroyed wasn't just a garden but years of careful cultivation. Weekends spent with my hands in the dirt, and even memories with neighbors who often admired the blooms, yet all of it was gone now, stripped away by Karen and her relentless obsession with control. And as I tried to piece together what to do next, I noticed a few of my neighbors cautiously approaching, their sympathetic eyes confirming that they too had seen Karen's audacious acts, some even telling me that they had tried to stop her, but Karen dismissed them with threats that the HOA rules gave her the authority. And though I was seething, I forced myself to stay calm and documented everything with photos, walking up and down the yard, capturing every bare mound of soil, the upturned flower pots lying smashed to the side, and even the few roots sticking up where plants had been pulled out with force, all while my mind whirled with the knowledge that this wasn't just vandalism, it was a serious violation of property rights. And Karen had crossed a line far beyond petty HOA disputes, so that night I sat down at my desk, gathered all the documentation, and began researching state laws about HOA powers, property rights, and potential recourse for property destruction. Quickly discovering that while HOAs do have some authority, they cannot remove private landscaping without due process, especially when it exists entirely within the property boundaries and does not obstruct community areas. Which meant Karen hadn't just overstepped, she had set herself up for legal repercussions. Yet I didn't want to rush. I wanted to be methodical. So the next morning I made an appointment with a local attorney who specialized in HOA conflicts. And when I laid out everything for him, from the photos of the garden to the statements from neighbors who witnessed, Karen and her self-appointed landscaping team ripping up my plants, he shook his head slowly and said this was one of the most flagrant abuses of HOA authority he had seen in years, explaining that under state statutes, what Karen had done wasn't just a violation of HOA guidelines, it bordered on criminal mischief and property destruction, and that we could file both a civil claim and seek damages. while also reporting her to the State Department that oversaw HOA operations. And hearing that gave me a strange mix of relief and anticipation, because I realized Karen wasn't going to get away with this. Though when word started spreading around the neighborhood that I had contacted legal counsel, Karen began parading around with even more arrogance, telling anyone who would listen that she was within her rights to remove unsightly gardens and that her actions were supported by the HOA board, which only infuriated my neighbors who had seen firsthand how beautiful and well kept my garden was, and some even came forward to give me written statements describing exactly what Karen had done and how she had warned them to stay out of her way. So I compiled all of this into a thick file that I knew would be damning evidence once things moved forward. But before I could even send the official complaint, something happened that shifted everything in my favor. Because one afternoon, while I was still dealing with the aftermath of the garden removal, a plain white envelope from the State Department of Housing and Community Oversight arrived in my mailbox. And though it wasn't addressed to me, the return stamp made it clear that it was official. And soon enough, I found out through a neighbor who happened to sit on a small advisory board in town that Karen herself had received a notice of violation. The state had already been tipped off about her actions, likely through one of the witnesses, and they were now investigating the HOA for unlawful enforcement practices.
Meaning?
Karen wasn't just dealing with my potential lawsuit, but also the scrutiny of a powerful state agency. And though I didn't yet know the details of what they would impose, the fact that Karen had been flagged gave me the fuel I needed to push forward more confidently. Because suddenly this wasn't just my fight. It was a case of an abusive HOA leader finally being caught in a web of her own making. And yet Karen still strutted around, refusing to acknowledge she was in trouble, throwing little digs at me whenever she saw me in the driveway, muttering things about how messy gardens lowered property values. Even though everyone else in the neighborhood knew she had destroyed something that was a source of beauty and pride, so I focused on building my case, staying calm, and letting the legal and state processes work. But the tension grew heavier each day, with neighbors whispering that Karen had been seen angrily calling board members, holding frantic meetings behind closed doors, and even trying to convince others to testify that my garden had been a nuisance. Though nobody seemed willing to lie for her this time, not after what they'd seen, and I knew that her fake confidence was just a mask. Because beneath it, she must have been terrified of the consequences closing in around her. Consequences she could no longer brush aside as easily as knocking over a flower pot. As the days passed after the letter from the state agency landed in Karen's mailbox, I noticed subtle cracks in her once unshakable demeanor. Because though she still put on her usual act of authority, barking orders at neighbors about where to park their cars or how to trim their hedges, there was a nervous edge to her tone. And for the first time, people began openly pushing back, some even laughing when she tried to assert her power, which only made her more flustered. And while she fought to maintain her grip on the HOA board, I received a call from the investigator assigned to the case who asked if I would provide my evidence and witness accounts. And when I brought the thick folder of photographs, neighbor statements, and even the before and after shots of my flourishing garden compared to the barren soil she left behind, the investigator's expression told me all I needed to know. We're taking this seriously, explaining that HOAs often try to exceed their authority, but that rarely did they see such a blatant act of personal vendetta turned into destructive action. And he hinted that fines and disciplinary action against Karen and possibly the HOA board were already in the works. Which reassured me, but Karen seemed oblivious to how cornered she was, because one evening she marched to my front door and knocked hard enough that I thought she might break the glass, and when I opened it, she stood there with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line as she hissed, "You think you're going to win? The HOA has more power than you. Think. Your little garden was against community standards, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." To which I calmly replied that I had already turned everything over to the state. And the look on her face when I said that was priceless, because her bravado cracked, her eyes flickered with real fear before she snapped, "You'll regret this," and stormed away. But as her threats grew more desperate, the community's patience with her crumbled. Neighbors who had once been intimidated by her began approaching me with their own stories of harassment and overreach. Tales of fines for trivial things like having a flower pot the wrong color or a wind chime that she claimed was too loud. And all of this added fuel to the growing case against her, because I passed each account to the investigator, who said it was painting a picture of systemic abuse, not just one isolated incident. And in the meantime, I began the slow process of replanting parts of my garden, even though it hurt to start from scratch, yet it also gave me strength. Because each new seed I pressed into the soil felt like an act of defiance against Karen's destruction, and neighbors began helping too, offering cuttings from their own plants, tools, and even afternoons of labor to restore what Karen had taken, creating a sense of unity in the community that I hadn't felt before. And I realized that in trying to break me, Karen had actually brought everyone else closer together, united against her reign of control. Though she still fought back with every ounce of her energy, filing complaint letters to the HOA board about me, trying to label me as a troublemaker, but they carried little weight now because the board itself was fractured, some of them turning on Karen after realizing they too might be held liable for her actions. And whispers began circulating that she had been warned by the state office about potential fines, not only for the HOA, but for her personally. A fact confirmed when I saw her in the street one afternoon angrily waving a document and shouting into her phone, her face red with panic as she ranted about unjust government interference. Though from my perspective it was nothing more than long overdue accountability. Yay. And yet what made it all the more satisfying was knowing she had done this to herself. Her arrogance had pushed her to act recklessly, and now the very authority she clung to was collapsing under her. But even so, I knew better than to underestimate her. Because Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully, I suspected she would fight tooth and nail until the last possible moment. So I kept building my case, carefully documenting every interaction, every witness statement, every small sign of retaliation. Because I had learned that with people like Karen, you needed an ironclad defense to withstand the storm they unleashed when cornered. And though my patience was tested daily, I could feel momentum shifting. The balance of power no longer tilted in her favor, but slowly, steadily swinging toward justice. And deep down, I knew that the day was coming when Karen would finally face the consequences she had spent years evading. A day when the very system she had weaponized against others would rise up against her and show her that no one, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was above the law. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tension, whispers, and simmering hostilities. Because while the state's investigation was quietly progressing, Karen ramped up her retaliation in ways that bordered on desperation, filing noise complaints against me even though my property was quiet, photographing my yard as if searching for some violation, and even harassing the neighbors who had helped me replant by accusing them of conspiring to undermine the HOA's authority. But the more she lashed out, the more people grew tired of her antics. Because one evening a neighbor named Helen stopped by my house with a cup of coffee and said, "We've had enough. We're organizing a petition to remove her from the SDR board." And hearing that gave me a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare could be coming to an end. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Because a few days later, she held an emergency HOA meeting in the clubhouse, summoning everyone with flyers on their doors claiming there would be a vote on new regulations. Though in reality it was just her attempt to rally support, and I attended, sitting in the back quietly as she stood at the front of the room, her voice sharp and shrill as she painted herself as the victim of a smear campaign, claiming outside forces were trying to take away the HOA's power, that anyone supporting me was threatening the community's values. But to her dismay, instead of applause or agreement, she was met with skeptical stares and murmurs of dissent, and when one neighbor raised their hand and asked why she had destroyed my garden when it was full of pollinator plants and completely in line with state guidelines, Karen faltered, her face tightening as she stammered something about aesthetic uniformity, only for another neighbor to shout, "We like gardens." And soon, voices were rising around the room, people venting years of pent-up frustration over her ridiculous fines, her harassment, her controlling behavior. And for the first time, she was visibly cornered in her own arena, scrambling to regain control, but her words carried less and less weight. And when someone mentioned the investigation and the possibility of state fines, the room went quiet as eyes turned toward her, and the flash of panic that crossed her face betrayed what she had been trying to keep hidden, that the state had indeed warned her and the HOA, and that she was under real scrutiny. So she abruptly ended the meeting, storming out with her papers clutched against her chest, her heels clicking angrily against the floor as if she could stomp out her failure. But word spread quickly afterward, and within days the petition Helen mentioned had gained overwhelming support, with dozens of signatures calling for her removal. And though the process was complicated and required formal votes, it was clear that the tide had shifted, because while Karen tried to keep up appearances, I noticed the way she avoided certain neighbors, the way her smile looked forced, the way her once booming presence was now brittle and defensive, and it made me think about how power built on intimidation is always fragile, always waiting to collapse under its own weight. Yet that didn't stop her from escalating in other ways. Because one night I came home to find my mailbox stuffed with anonymous letters, crude attempts to intimidate me with phrases like, "You don't belong here, and leave before it's too late," but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Loopy and dramatic as always, and instead of scaring me, it only made my case stronger, because I photographed each one and forwarded them to the investigator, who later told me they were keeping track of everything as a potential pattern of harassment. And though part of me hated being caught in this endless cycle of conflict, another part found strength in standing firm because I had something Karen didn't: the truth, the law, and now the community behind me. And as spring turned into summer, and my replanted garden began to bloom again with bursts of color, butterflies and bees, it felt symbolic, a reminder that destruction can always be followed by regrowth, that resilience could outshine cruelty. But in the back of my mind, I knew the biggest blow to Karen was still to come, because the state wasn't finished. And when their findings became official, it would no longer be a matter of neighborhood squabbles, but of legal accountability. And that looming shadow was something Karen couldn't intimidate or manipulate her way out of, no matter how much she tried, and I could sense the walls closing in. Not just around her, but around the very power structure she had ruled for years. And though I knew the battle wasn't over, I could feel the momentum carrying us all toward the moment when justice would finally arrive in a form she couldn't ignore: fine, a ruling, or even her removal. And that thought alone gave me the patience to endure her desperate thrashing, because the end of her reign was no longer a matter of if, but when. The day the letter came, the whole neighborhood seemed to feel it, because even though it was addressed to Karen directly, everyone knew something big was brewing when the certified mail truck stopped at her house and the driver made her sign for a thick envelope. And within hours, whispers began circulating, neighbors speculating about what was inside, and I didn't have to wait long to find out. Because by that evening, Helen knocked on my door, her eyes sparkling with the kind of excitement that only comes when justice is close at hand. And she whispered she got hit with a massive state fine. They're holding her personally accountable for violating environmental protection laws. And I stood there stunned, because though I had hoped for this moment, hearing the words out loud made it real, and it was like the air itself felt lighter, as if the grip Karen had on everyone's lives had loosened at last. But the story didn't stop there, because apparently the letter also demanded that she and the HOA restore my garden or compensate me for the damage at their own expense. Which meant not only had Karen failed to destroy what she hated, she now had to pay for its return, and the UHS. Irony of it nearly made me laugh out loud, but I held it back. Instead, thanking Helen for sharing the news and watching as word spread like wildfire down the street, groups of neighbors standing on driveways murmuring, shaking their heads, and even smiling for the first time in what felt like ages, and I couldn't resist taking a quiet walk past Karen's house, where I saw her blinds twitch as if she were spying from behind them, her car still parked crookedly in the driveway, but no sign of her outside, which was unusual given how often she paraded around the block to flaunt her self-appointed authority. And I realized the mighty Karen, the one who once barked orders and delivered fines without hesitation, was now hiding from the very community she tormented. And it was a strange reversal, like watching a predator suddenly cornered by prey that refused to run anymore. But the true turning point came at the next HOA meeting, when she tried to downplay the fine as a misunderstanding and claimed she was appealing it, though her voice lacked its usual confidence, and for the first time, people openly laughed at her. No longer intimidated, no longer willing to buy her excuses. And when Helen stood up and read aloud from the state's ruling, which had already been shared online, confirming that Karen had acted outside her authority and illegally destroyed my property, the room erupted in applause, people cheering not just for me but for themselves, because this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about years of mistreatment, and the fine symbolized the crumbling of her power, but Karen didn't take it well, her face flushing red as she shouted, "This is harassment. You're all against me." Only for someone in the back to yell, "We've been against you for years." And the laughter that followed broke her in a way no fine ever could, because in that moment she realized she had lost the one thing she valued most: control. And as she stormed out of the clubhouse, muttering about lawyers and conspiracies, neighbors exchanged looks that said it all. She was done. And though technically she still held her position on the board, it was now an empty title. Her authority hollow, because no one respected her. No one feared her, and without those, her reign was nothing. And I left the meeting that night feeling lighter than I had in months, knowing the balance had shifted for good, yet the saga wasn't finished because fines could be appealed. And Karen was too stubborn to go quietly, which meant there would be more battles ahead, but this time the community wasn't divided. They were united, and that made all the difference, because she could throw tantrums and hire lawyers, but she couldn't erase the truth of what she had done, nor could she erase the fact that for the first time, she was the one under a microscope. Her every move scrutinized, her every misstep documented, and I had no doubt the state would be watching closely too. Because once you've been caught abusing power, it's only a matter of time before the rest unravels. And though I knew Karen wouldn't surrender easily, I also knew she was no longer the unstoppable force she pretended to be. She was just a woman, cornered by her own arrogance, facing consequences she never thought would reach her doorstep. Karen's desperation showed itself almost immediately after the HOA meeting humiliation, because the very next morning, before sunrise, neighbors reported hearing her slamming her car door and driving off in a fury, only to return a few hours later with a stack of papers in her arms, which turned out to be legal documents she tried to wave around as proof that she was taking this to court, insisting loudly on her driveway that she was filing a lawsuit against me personally, the HOA board, and even the state itself, claiming it was all an orchestrated witch hunt designed to destroy her. But instead of striking fear, her theatrics only drew eye rolls and chuckles from neighbors who had finally grown tired of her drama. And while she attempted to hand out copies of her so-called legal case, most people refused to even take them, muttering things like, "She's lost her mind." And good luck with that, as they walked away, leaving her standing there with her papers fluttering in the wind. And though I knew Karen well enough to understand she wouldn't stop at empty threats, the sheer level of her delusions surprised me. Because not only did she claim her actions were justified under community beautification standards, she also alleged that my garden was a safety hazard and a breeding ground for pests. Arguments so flimsy they would have been comical if they weren't being used to try to ruin my life. But the truth was, her lawsuit had no foundation, and the state's ruling already declared my garden protected under local conservation laws, meaning her case was doomed before it even began. Yet she filed anyway, dragging everyone into unnecessary stress. Because that's who Karen was. If she couldn't win, she'd burn the whole field down trying. Oh, what she didn't count on was how united the neighborhood had become. Because once she started demanding donations for her legal fees, going door to door with a clipboard, people shut her down flat. Some even slamming doors in her face, and word spread quickly that her GoFundMe page, where she tried to solicit online sympathy, was a total flop, gathering only a handful of dollars compared to the massive costs she faced. And watching her flounder like this was surreal, because for years she had thrived on manipulating fear and exploiting weakness. But now, stripped of her authority, she was exposed for what she truly was, a bully with no real power. And though she still had venom, the sting no longer landed, because everyone had learned how to push back. But her desperation didn't stop there, because when she realized money wouldn't come from neighbors, she turned to intimidation, parking her car in front of my house at odd hours, leaving her headlights on, and even circling the block slowly as if trying to rattle me, but I refused to let her see me shaken. Instead, documenting everything, snapping photos, recording videos, because I knew that sooner or later she'd cross a line that would bury her completely, and sure enough, she did. Because one night, around midnight, she crept into my yard with a flashlight, thinking no one would notice. But my security cameras caught her on film, pulling up what little remained of plants that had started to regrow naturally. And the next morning, I turned that footage over to the state enforcement officer already monitoring her case, and within a week, another letter arrived at her door, this one harsher, warning that continued interference would result not just in steeper fines, but in possible criminal charges for trespassing and harassment. And when the news spread through the neighborhood, Karen's last scraps of support evaporated, even among the handful of people who had once tolerated her out of fear, because now she wasn't just the tyrant HOA president, she was a reckless, unhinged neighbor willing to break the law. And I could see it in her eyes when I caught a glimpse of her storming to her mailbox. How much it ate away at her. Guess, this wasn't how she imagined things would go. She believed she was invincible, but now the system she once weaponized against others was closing in on her, and for all her bluster about fighting back, she was slowly crumbling, snapping at delivery drivers, screaming at kids playing too close to her lawn, and muttering to herself during her angry walks, as if replaying her downfall in her mind over and over. And though I knew it wasn't over yet, I could feel the tide turning more firmly with the desperate move she made, because the harder she fought, the deeper she sank. And it became clear that the final unraveling was near. It's the point where all her lies, threats, and arrogance would finally collapse under the weight of reality. And as I watched her spiral, I couldn't help but feel both satisfaction and a strange pity, because in the end, Karen wasn't some powerful figure. After all, she was just a lonely, bitter woman who built her identity on control, and once that control was stripped away, she had nothing left but rage, and rage, as everyone knows, burns itself out eventually, leaving only ashes. The breaking point came faster than anyone expected, because while Karen was still stomping around acting as though she had power, the HOA board had been quietly meeting without her, preparing a motion to officially strip her of her title as president, citing misconduct, harassment, and financial mismanagement. When the day of the vote arrived, she showed up in her usual dramatic fashion, carrying binders and shouting about how this was an illegal coup, but the board had the authority, and with a unanimous vote, she was removed from her position and permanently barred from ever holding office again. And the sound of neighbors cheering outside the meeting hall was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A collective exhale of relief after years of being under her thumb. But her humiliation didn't stop there, because just days later she received the official state notice, not only reaffirming her original fine for destroying my garden, but escalating it into a series of penalties that added up to nearly $20,000. Along with a stern warning that her trespassing incident was being referred to law enforcement for further review. And when I saw her on her porch, reading that letter with her hands trembling and her face pale, I realized she had finally hit the wall she could not climb, because no amount of yelling or finger-pointing could erase a fine that size, or could her broken reputation convince anyone to come to her aid. And for the first time since I'd known her, Karen looked truly small. Shadow of the woman who once strutted around the neighborhood, barking orders and lording her power over everyone else. But the collapse of her reign didn't just freed the entire community. Because suddenly people who had been too afraid to plant flowers or paint their doors now felt brave enough to reclaim their homes. Vibrant gardens began to appear, kids played without fear of being scolded, and a spirit of neighborliness returned that had been missing for so long. And though Karen still lived among us, she was no longer feared, only pitied, a woman sitting alone on her porch, grumbling under her breath while the rest of us moved forward. And in a strange way, her downfall was poetic, because she had tried to destroy something that symbolized growth in life, my garden, But in the end, it was that very garden, supported by the law and cherished by neighbors, that became the weapon of her undoing. And I can't describe the satisfaction of seeing her frozen in place. The day the sheriff's deputy arrived to formally serve her with paperwork about her escalating fines, her eyes wide with disbelief as if she had never imagined this could happen to her, the once all-powerful HOA queen reduced to a defendant drowning in debt, stripped of the very authority she used to control us. And though it may sound harsh, there was justice in it, because for too long she had used rules as a sword to cut others down. But now, those same rules had turned back on her like a mirror, forcing her to see who she truly was, and I knew, watching her slump into her chair with the letter crumpled in her fist, that this was the final chapter of her reign, because no one would ever follow her again, and her name would forever be tied not to leadership, but to disgrace. And that night, as I watered the fresh shoots of green sprouting in my restored garden, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. Guess the fight was over and the garden had won. And if there's one thing to take from this story, it's that bullies always believe they're untouchable until the day reality comes knocking at their door. And when it does, it hits harder than they could ever imagine. So if you've ever faced a Karen in your life, remember, this: stand your ground. Document everything and never stop fighting for what's right, because justice has a way of finding those who think they're above it, and Karen's frozen face, as the fines piled up, was proof enough of that. And if you want to hear more jaw-dropping HOA stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because the next story is even wilder than this, and you won't want to miss it.